Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. The C Channel team are very pleased to be here at Queen Mary University of London. We're joined by Dr Kim Wagner. Dr Wagner has been studying imperial history for many years, particularly the British Raj in India, and has recently released a book to mark the 100-year centenary remembrance of Jallianwala Bagh, the massacre in Amritsar in Vaisakhi 1919. Dr Wagner, welcome. Thank you for joining the Sikh channel and inviting us to your office here at the Queen Mary University of London.
Thank you for coming.
Can you briefly tell us about yourself, about your childhood, where you grew up, and how you became a student and a professor of British imperial history?
So I'm originally Danish, and my parents, they were hippies. They took me to India as a child. I'm named after Kipling's novel. I was brought up on a solid diet of colonial literature, so I never really had a choice. And I did my undergraduate studies in Copenhagen in Denmark, but then I went to Cambridge for my PhD, and I got stuck here. And so I started out working on banditry in early 19th century India, the Thuggi, and then I wrote about 1857. And now I've moved on up to the 20th century and to the Amritsar Jallianwala Bagh Massacre of 1919, slowly making my way through history of British India.
And why did you focus on British India, particularly? Because you've expressed an interest in India generally through your parents and your upbringing, and it covers a very big expanse of history, the Indian subcontinent. What drew you to the British colonial period?
I think it was originally sort of children's literature, Kipling, Henty, later on Flashman, stuff like that, sort of the adventure that got me interested. But then I pursued what was essentially childhood interests as an academic study, and taking a rather more critical look at what actually happened.
And you've become an expert now on British imperial history in India, and you cover quite a defined time period. What's the time period you are particularly interested in?
So I would say I'm confident, at least, in the 19th century and then up till 1919. So it's a sort of the transition between the East India Company rule and then the early days of British India after 1857.
Did you also cover the rule of Maharaja Ranjit Singh at all? Did you touch upon that during your research?
I do a bit. In my previous book, I wrote about the outbreak in 1857 in the Punjab, in Sialkot, in what is today Pakistan. And that was, of course, recently conquered territory, which is why the sepoys of the Bengal army did not feel any particular friendship with the local population, and were in a sense as much strangers as the British were in the Punjab during that period.
Jallianwala Bagh has a very special memory for the Sikh and Punjabi community, and we mark 100 years of remembering this awful massacre as quite an appalling event. You've written a very detailed book, a detailed account about this event, and it numbers over 250 pages. How long did the research take you?
More than I'd care to remember, 5-6 years at least, and then I think I probably wrote it up in about a year's time. It's a big topic, and a lot has been written about it, so it took time. There's a lot of books on the subject already, and when you have to produce something new, you have to make sure that you are actually covering the ground thoroughly.
So, Dr. Wagner, we'd like you to take us through your book. Perhaps not read it. It's quite a long book that'll take several hours, if not days. And it seems extremely well researched, and you've got a very good pedigree and standing as a researcher and a historian. But I would like to go through the book, perhaps chapter by chapter, and start off with chapter 1, because you set the scene for Jallianwala Bagh, and it's titled, the prologue is titled Shadows of the Mutiny, And it seems to be quite a study into psychology, perhaps at times, rather than history. So can you perhaps set the scene for this book?
So one of the things I think is often overlooked, but is really one of the key points to understand about what happened in 1919, is that it wasn't actually just about 1919. And in many ways, the British, they were perceiving events after the end of the First World War through the lens of 1857. So my overall argument is that really it's the trauma or the memories of what the British refer to as the mutiny that determines how the British, they respond to local unrest in Punjab in 1919. And therefore, to set the scene, I'm talking about the colonial mindset, which to some extent you can also talk about the Punjab tradition of colonial administration, which is about the man on the spot being given great leeway in terms of basically discretionary measures, the need to nip any kind of unrest in the bud before it escalates. And 1857, having 1857 in the background always means that even the most minute riots or unrest, as far as the British are concerned, has the potential at least to escalate into something that will challenge the Raj. And therefore we see after 1857 the British tend to overreact with excessive forms of violence.
1857 to 1919 is a long time. It's almost half a century. Yeah. So the effects on the psyche of those events, the mutiny, must have been very deeply felt by the British Raj.
Oh, absolutely. It provides a blueprint for the successful governance of the British in India. But it's also a sort of popular wisdom and also a narrative that you read about in novels. So every single Englishman in India in 1919 would have heard about the mutiny, but almost suddenly, maybe from people who had been there, or people who were related to people who had experienced it themselves. But it's also all the novels. I mean, you literally have hundreds of novels about the mutiny, which all tell the same story about the betrayal of the British by supposedly loyal Indians and the threat posed to white women by brown-skinned men. And that very much became sort of the foundational narrative of the British, the colonial mindset, which was still very much in dominance by 1919.
And chapter 1 is titled Pool of Nectar, and that refers to the holy city of Amritsar. Have you been to Amritsar?
Oh yes, many times. I've spent quite a bit of time there. For me, it was very important to get a sense of the space. The book doesn't have any protagonist as such, but I would say the city of Amritsar is really the key protagonist. To have a sense of the urban space, the layout, understand how you move around. And one of the key things about Amritsar during 1919 is, of course, that you have the railway lines running through. On the one side, you have the civil lines with the mall, the sort of ruler straight roads laid out, and the bungalows where the Saabs and Mem Saabs, they lived. And on the other side, as you enter the old city through what was then Hall Gate, you have the old Amritsar surrounded by the medieval wall. And you have the sort of labyrinth, small alleyways, and sort of traditional bazaars, and very, very closely built houses. And of course leading up to the Golden Temple itself, which was then as now the sort of the heart of Amritsar. And
the alleyways you've described and the medieval structures and walls, do they still exist today? I hope they've been preserved.
You can certainly get a sense of what Amritsar is like. You still have open sewers, you still have trash, and you still have these sort of buildings that are built so close that you can walk through the alleyways, but barely any light seeps down. It's for me, it's an absolutely beautiful place, and I love to get lost in Amritsar, which is quite easy as you venture off the main thoroughfares.
And can you tell us about the research that you did for this particular book? Because I doubt there's only surviving eyewitnesses now from the events of 1919.
There are no longer any survivors. There are some relatives. But what I did was I did not really look at the history of Amritsar as it's been remembered after the event itself. So I focused very, very narrowly on April 1919. The chapters they take you through, there are some chapters that are one day, and the 13th of April is 2 chapters. So you can tell the scale of my narrative is really quite detailed. So what I wanted to do was to really paint a picture of the place at the most detailed level possible and get a real sense of what it would have felt like to be there. Because one of the things about an event such as the Amritsar Massacre is when you lived through it, when you experienced it, you didn't know it was the Amritsar Massacre. You didn't know it was the watershed event that 100 years later would be commemorated, that 100 years later there'd be demands for an apology. People who lived through these chaotic and bloody days in April, they were trying to make sense of the chaos. They were afraid for their own lives. And trying to get into that individual and personal experience is what for me has been most interesting.
And Jallianwala Bagh is something that many Punjabis and Sikhs grew up with, and we have quite a defined version which is recounted to us often by our parents. And at the Gurdwara, there'll be the Daddis who will sing about Jallianwala Bagh and the heroes who avenged this atrocity. But when you look at it through the cold lens of a historian, the reality can be quite different. Can you perhaps take us through the events of the day itself?
So you have a few days before, on the 10th of April, the Governor-General of Punjab, Michael O'Dwyer, decides to deport 2 of the local political leaders, nationalist leaders, Dr. Kichlu and Dr. Satyapal, essentially to cut the head off the snake, as the British perceive it, and remove the leaders that are challenging the Raj. So the British think that this preemptive action will, in a sense, stop the unrest. And what it does is it provokes unrest. And so as the local Gandhian Satyagraha activists, they try and make their way into the civil lines where the British have their offices and where they live. They're stopped by armed military. And the British are panicking and are pushed back. People start throwing stones, and the British, they open fire because what they perceive it as an invasion of the British lines. They literally talk about, the mob spilling across a golf course and attacking the bungalows. That's what the British are seeing. But of course, from an Indian perspective, it's a fully legitimate approach to the British authorities because nobody's talking about independence at this point of time. They're actually on the 10th of April. When you have the first riots, local residents, they think they are in a position to negotiate and reason with the British and convince the British authorities to release their leaders. But to the British, it's 1857 all over again. So this soldiers. So you already have this sort of escalation of violence before the Amritsar Massacre takes place. Several banks are looted and burned, and the British perceive Amritsar city as being in a stage of war. And they see that is enemy territory.
Because one of your paragraph talks about anarchy.
Yeah, and that's what the British misread Indian national protests to a devastating degree. Yes. They think that all they're thinking about is either 1857 or the Gada conspiracy of the First World War, and that is the mindset. For the British, there's no such thing as spontaneous protest. There's no such thing as a peaceful Indian crowd. Any form of Indian political activism is seen as a threat.
So it's a real state of paranoia?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That's what it is.
And why is that? Was British Raj coming to a natural end? Was it very tenuous? Did they have a weak hold upon the country?
It's really interesting because by 1919 the British have been in Punjab for more than half a century. They've been in India for more than a century. So you can't say it's a weak hold. It's not like they're an occupying force that just arrived. Everybody has grown up under British rule. But that's one of the really interesting things, and I think one of the legacies of 1857. The British feel that it's a tenuous hold. The British do not feel confident. They feel vulnerable and isolated to a large extent, especially when you have these sort of moments of unrest. And that's why they overreact, as it were. But between 1857 and 1919, you have the revolutionary nationalists in places like Bengal. You have the Ghadar movement, but that's on a minute scale. The British have just gone through the First World War, where there's widespread support for the British war effort. And yet, the British never really feel safe. And that's where it gets really dangerous, yes, when you have what is effectively a paranoid mindset.
Can you tell us about the actual day?
Yeah.
Jallianwala Bagh. Jallianwala Bagh is a place of public gathering.
It's not the nice park you see today, but it served many of the same purposes. It was a popular picnic spot, but it's also a place where people would dump their trash, where kids would play. So they would be playing cricket. There were some buffaloes grazing there. And it's extremely secluded. Today, all roads, in a sense, lead to Jallianwala Bagh because it's on the tourist itinerary on the way to the Golden Temple. But in 1919, it was secluded and sort of closed off, not easily accessible. So what it actually is, it's a kind of a safe space, yes, away from the prying eyes of the British. And General Dyer has by that time arrived, perceiving himself to be faced by a rebellion. They have armored cars have arrived from Lahore. There's military airplanes, and there's more than 1,000 colonial troops gathered in Amritsar, because there's, of course, not just things going on in Amritsar. It's all over Punjab. There are telegraph lines being torn up and railway communication interrupted. And Dyer, he spends the morning of the 13th of April effectively going on procession through Amritsar.
With the troops.
With troops and proclaiming that all meetings and gatherings are prohibited, will be fired on, and that there will be a curfew in place from 8 o'clock that evening. So Dyer believes that he has now warned the residents of Amritsar not to provoke the authorities, not to gather, not to what he sees as communicating with political agitators or engaging in anything that's unlawful. And on the way back from that procession, he hears that a meeting has been announced at Jallianwala Bagh. And he sees that as a response to his prohibition, and therefore as a direct provocation. It wasn't actually. The meeting had been...
It's very much sort of a black and white way of looking at things. It's very stark.
Oh, absolutely. But there's no real sense of Dyer understanding what's going on. Because Amritsar, the city of Amritsar, is not in a state of rebellion. There's been no unrest for several days. You don't have these armed crowds, yes, of rebels that he imagines there to be. But that is the very dangerous aspect of the situation.
And in terms of the troops General Dyer commanded, can you tell us about their composition?
So he actually has 1,000 troops, more than 1,000 troops at his disposal. He has British troops. But when he hears about the meeting and he collects a special force to go into Jallianwala Bagh, he positions the British troops along the city gates around Amritsar, because what he thinks is he's going into enemy territory. So he needs to have troops that he can rely on to extract him if he's ambushed. That's his mindset. And the troops he takes in are Gurkhas and Baluchis. 50 troops armed with rifles, 40 troops, Gurkhas who only have kukris, and then 2 armored cars with machine guns. So what he is thinking of is that he's venturing into the heartland of the rebels, and that they might try and ambush him, which is why he conducts himself as if this is a military operation. And of course, there's also the element of reasserting British authority during the riots on the 10th of April, a white woman had been attacked, and that in particular provoked the British.
And so General Dyer made his way to Jallianwala Bagh on that fateful day, 13th of April 1919. When he got there, what did he see? What did he come across? Looking through his eyes.
Through his eyes, he came in and he saw a large gathering after he had just spent all day prohibiting gatherings. So, and he made up his mind within 30 seconds. Came in with his troops, 50 armed troops, and within 30 seconds he ordered them to open fire. Because for him, the gathering that he perceived were the very same rebels who had just a few days earlier run amok through the streets of Amritsar and had attacked and killed Europeans. And
did he not see the civilians, the women and children, and the unarmed nature of the crowd? He didn't see any of that.
No, he didn't have enough time to see it, but also, I mean, what faced him was, without any doubt, an unarmed and peaceful crowd. There were nobody. Even the speeches we have the speeches. They've survived, and they're not revolutionary in nature or even anti-British. They talk about sending petitions to the British government and asking for Kichlu and Sajapal to be released. There's nothing dangerous or really in any way offensive about the political meeting that's taking place.
And were there speeches? Was there a stage erected and people making speeches?
There's a makeshift stage erected, not too far from where the well inside Jallianwala Bagh is. And there were a number of local speakers talking to the crowd. Some people had come to listen to speeches. It wasn't even clear who had announced the meeting or what the speeches were. But there were also a lot of people who were simply there spending the afternoon. It was near 5 o'clock in the afternoon, getting a bit cooler, and so there were lots of children playing, grandparents with their grandchildren, families. There were not that many women. There were a few women only, because there's a period of time where women don't really participate in public events such as these. In that respect, the popular depiction of the massacre, as in the Gandhi movie, for instance, is somewhat misleading in the sense that it shows women and children. There were children there, but very few women.
Yes. And what happened next?
Well, then
the soldiers lined up and started fighting on civilians. Was it a scene of chaos?
It was an absolute, horrific massacre. I mean, when they open fire, it's at point-blank range. There are people in the crowd who are 10, 15 yards from the soldiers. But of course, we're talking about a crowd between 15, 20,000 people. And they tried to escape from this sort of incessant hail of bullets. I mean, the troops, they fire famously 1,650 rounds over a course of 10 minutes. And Dyer directs the fire towards the exits. There are parts of the wall, especially behind the Samadhi, where you can actually crawl over. So people try and get out whichever way they can, but bodies pile up near the exits, block the exits. There are a lot of people who are stampeded and killed in that way. But it's an absolute slaughter, no question about it.
And how many people were actually killed during this awful incident?
We won't ever know for sure. The British agreed that 379 people were killed. There were some estimates from eyewitnesses who said, they saw at least 1,000 bodies there. But the actual investigation carried out by the Indian National Congress and local Indian charities who went door to door in Amritsar and in the villages beyond after martial law had been lifted, they gathered the names of 540. So my estimate would be that something like 500-600 people were killed and probably 1,500 wounded.
And what was the immediate aftermath of this massacre on that particular day? General Dyer, he turned around and marched his troops out again.
Yes, he didn't stop, he didn't pause, because he still thought he was carrying out a military operation and he did not want to be ambushed in the streets. So he went back to the Rambagh where the military was encamped. And later that night, at 8 o'clock, the curfew came into place, and so the dead and the dying were left there by their relatives. I mean, there were a couple of hours where people could go to the Bagh and save whom they could. There were a lot of wounded people. But by 8 o'clock, those who were left were abandoned. Doctors, Indian doctors or medical assistants wouldn't venture out of their houses. And so you have these horrific accounts of people spending the night in the Bagh alone, without any kind of medical aid. At 10 p.m., Dyer goes back into Amritsar with his troops to ensure that the curfew is being observed, and thus, very, very clearly making it absolutely impossible for any assistance to be given to the wounded.
So, from the account you've given, we can see that General Dyer was a very callous man, very calculating, and he effectively executed many civilians, and is often depicted as a sort of an evil character in Indian cinema. Is there more to the man than this evil, horrible man who killed all these civilians?
I think one of the problems is that we focus a lot on Dyer's personality. He carried out the massacre, but he wasn't even the worst. There were other British officers who suggested they should bomb Amritsar city from the air with bombs, and they later do bomb Jallianwala and elsewhere. So he's not unique by any means. What he did, it's likely that another officer in his place would have done something similar. And you can see the kind of things that are being said. What he says when he defends his actions is no different from what British officers had said in 1857, or after the execution of Namdaris at Malakotla in 1872.
Yes.
You have exactly the same logic of colonial violence, which is, it didn't matter whether the people getting killed were guilty or not. The fact that they were killed set an example for everybody else, a warning that the British were not to be provoked or challenged.
And what was the reaction back home in Britain to this act?
Well, initially it's nothing, because there is martial law declared on the 19th of April, and there's a complete blackout of press. So actually, the local British authorities, including Dyer, are not too concerned with what had happened. And in London, they don't know about it. They don't actually get any real information until December 1919, by which time news has seeped out and the Indian National Congress has begun its own inquiry. But it's mainly due to the efforts of Indian nationalists that the British are, in a sense, forced to try and find out how many people were killed. And even then, of course, they end up with a very low estimate.
And where was Gandhi during this period?
Gandhi is in Mumbai a lot, so he becomes part of the inquiry. So he goes to Punjab, to Amritsar and Lahore and elsewhere towards the end of the year. Gandhi, but also Motilal Nehru and Pandit Mohan Malaviya. And they go to Amritsar, they go to Jallianwala Bagh, they interview survivors, they take photographs of the bullet holes and do this kind of an attempt at a forensic investigation. Gandhi still holds out hope that the British government will prove itself to be just and that they will denounce what happened. Rabindranath Tagore, on the end of May, that's a month and a half after the massacre, he returns his knighthood. It's very, very quick. It's before he knows the full details of what has happened. Tagore, in a sense, is very prescient in his action and immediately, returns his knighthood and denounces the British suppression. Gandhi doesn't return his imperial medals till early 1920, after it becomes clear through the Hunter inquiry exactly what it is that Dyer and other British officers in Punjab did at the time.
And you mentioned, Dr. Wagner, that the Indian national movement, whilst it was beginning to take shape, was not quite in full flow. How far was Jallianwala Bagh an opportunity for Gandhi and others to move forward with independence?
Gandhi didn't talk about independence. It's before the Amritsar massacre. It's not until 1920, as it becomes clear that there's a widespread support for General Dyer in London, and that he's forced to resign from the army, but that is effectively the only kind of punishment that he's ever given. So it's by August 1920 that Gandhi launches the non-cooperation movement, and for the first time Indian nationalists across the board, in a sense, they talk about independence as being the only viable option. So it is the Amritsar massacre itself and the aftermath which galvanizes the nationalist movement and makes independence the avowed aim of many nationalists.
Is it right to say that Jallianwala Bagh was a watershed moment when the independence movement began to take shape, and the sacrifice of those people in Amritsar that helped to get Indian independence in 1947?
I think there's no question that it was a watershed moment. I think a lot of other events were, in a sense, more crucial if we want to think about independence in 47. It's not until after 1947 that Jallianwala Bagh really becomes this sort of focal moment. It's in a sense teleological. We can only see it after independence, where that process, in a sense, started. But it is Jallianwala Bagh, the site itself, is bought by public subscription and by the International Congress in 1920. It's turned into a nationalist memorial almost immediately.
Does it become a tool for the nationalist movement? Is it a propaganda tool?
Oh, absolutely. And we have, I mean, of course, as you've already mentioned, we have the stories of figures like Udham Singh or Bhagat Singh very much being inspired by what happened at Jallianwala Bagh. And I think that is probably the way that the Amritsar massacre is usually thought, not for what happened as much as for what it inspired. And that's also why I don't really deal with the nationalist characters of freedom fighters as much, because that is, in a sense, the stories that have been told about Amritsar afterwards. And what I was really interested in is sort of finding out what happened then and there.
And what did you find new from your research? Because you researched for many years. Were there any new facts which you could share with us?
Well, I think one of the things that was really remarkable was that the people who gathered at Jallianwala Bagh on the 13th didn't know that they could be fired at. They didn't go there in order to protest British rule. They went there to, in a sense, call upon the British government to fulfill its obligation as a just government. And that right to there's an airplane flying over Jallianwala Bagh shortly before Dyer arrives, and people get worried, and some of the speakers from the platform, they say, the government are doing their job, leave them to theirs, and we'll do our thing, which is having a political meeting. And then, of course, you have General Dyer, who thinks this is a gathering of rebels who are set on destroying the Raj. And that, I think, is a really interesting thing, that you have people effectively facing each other, but what they're seeing are projections of their own fears or aspirations. Something else that came up in my research was the fact that there was no martial law in Amritsar until the 19th of April. Dyer acts as if there is martial law, but there isn't. So what he's actually doing is he's assuming control from the civil authorities. And so it's a complete grey area in which he operates during those days in mid-April. And the British government subsequently ignored the fact that Dyer, he acted outside of all legal frameworks, in a sense.
Were there any key players from the Sikh community in this episode in terms of protesting against this massacre or taking up the independence movement from Jallianwala Bagh? Did you come across any people from the Sikh community who were prominent?
Not really in the riots and the unrest itself. I mean, there's a sizable part of Amritsar was Sikhs, but it's, again, only 15% of the population. And those who are really active in the protests as leaders are Hindus and Muslims primarily. But Sikhs participated in the protest as well. And there were other places where Sikh leaders, they played a prominent role.
The two freedom fighters went on to avenge this atrocity were Sikhs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you tell us about them a little bit? Were they, in the films, they're often depicted as being present as children and traumatized by the whole event. Is that Bollywood fiction, or is it a historical fact?
Well, it's often depicted as if Udham Singh was present during the massacre, but I've found no evidence that he was. He may have been, but as a historian, you have to go on the facts. And I think both him and Bhagat Singh, what's interesting is not in a sense whether they were there or not, but the way that, again, the Amritsar massacre is the moment that sets them off on their journey and in a sense inspires their later actions. And so it's not what happened on the 13th of April that matters as much as what it inspired and the stories that were then told about Amritsar. And that's why we talk about Jallianwala Bagh as sort of the beginning of the end, or the opening shot, so to speak.
Because they went on in 1940, I think it was, to assassinate General Dyer.
Dwyer,
yes.
In London. But by that time, by 1940, of course, you had the Indian freedom struggle had, of course, undergone significant changes, and the end of the Raj was rather more certain than it had been in 1919.
Would they be considered as terrorists in today's environment because they shot and killed an official figure for their cause? Would they be classed as terrorists?
Oh, absolutely. But that follows the old saying that, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighters. And the revolutionary nationalists in India were still active both before and after Jallianwala Bagh. And in a way, their actions for the British justified both legal and police and military suppression.
General Dyer became something of a hero in the minds of the British public following this terrible massacre. How do you think his family would perceive him today?
Well, I know how they perceive him today. They perceive him as being essentially misunderstood, in the sense that he loved India and he had a good relationship with his Indian troops. And for many Britons today who have a somewhat nostalgic relationship with the empire, the Amritsar massacre was an unfortunate tragedy, but not one that really reflects on the British Raj more generally, which is also why you have people like David Cameron quoting Churchill, and all the speakers in the House of Commons early in February of this year, when they demanded an apology, they all quote Churchill, who said it was an event that stood in singular and sinister isolation, and it was unprecedented. So that paints a picture in which the Jallianwala Bagh massacre is a unique event, and Dyer a rogue officer, that the British Empire was a force for good in the world, and that this was an unfortunate accident. And historically, that's simply incorrect, and therefore a deeply problematic view to have. And it allows someone like Dyer to be effectively thrown under the bus as a rogue officer who tarnished the reputation of the empire, when in fact we know very well he had widespread support amongst the British population. Not everybody, by any means, but the conservative newspapers, the unionists, in terms of the Irish conflict that was coming underway at the time, all came out strongly in support of Dyer. And the Morning Post newspaper started a public fund which collected £26,000 for Dyer, who, by having been forced to resign, lost parts of his pension. So this was remuneration for his loss of income, as it were.
And it's been 100 years now since this massacre. The empire's gone. The British Empire has been relegated to history, and you are an expert studying the history of the British Empire. Have amends been made, do you think, by the British and the British government? Is there a need for an apology? Should there be an apology for what happened? Has there been any form of apology or acknowledgement that this was a terrible act?
It's a very good question. I think the most important thing for me personally is that there is an acknowledgement of what happened, not just at Jallianwala Bagh, but that in a sense the history of the empire is faced and taught properly and without any gloss one way or the other. The problem about an apology is that it could very well be made without an acknowledgement. So you apologize for Dyer making the wrong decision, but you don't actually apologize for the empire, or even acknowledge that the empire was, in part at least, characterized by great brutality. And so you can have an apology, and that's how it came out in the House of Lords, which ends up somewhat absurdly as being a celebration of British greatness. And that to me is deeply disturbing. So I think to have an honest historical reckoning would be far more important than what could very easily become a tokenistic gesture.
And Jallianwala Bagh, 100 years. Dr. Kim Wagner, your book is extremely impressive. There's a lot of research. What's your final message on this incident, which is very much a vivid history in the minds of the Sikh and Punjabi and the Indian community around the world? You've studied it at length, and you could be said to be an expert on Jallianwala Bagh. And also you've come from quite an objective standpoint. You're not...
I've tried, at least.
That's right. You're not from an English or an Indian background. You are Danish, so you're a little bit removed from both cultures. How would you sum this up in 5 minutes?
Well, what I've tried to do is to take an unsentimental approach and look at what happened. And what I think is important for us today, think about the kind of political landscape we are facing on the eve of Brexit, as it were. I think it's important to try and understand what happened, but also try and understand what happened from the different perspectives of the many different people who were involved. And if we reduce the past to this sort of balance sheet approach, where we say, oh, there's some bad things and some good things and we can weigh them up, we actually miss an opportunity to understand what really happened, because the past is more complex than it can be easily summarized with these labels of heroes and villains and good and bad. So all I can really say is that I hope that people will read the book and perhaps learn a bit more about what it is that they want to demand an apology for, but also simply to understand how something as horrific as this could happen in 1919.
Dr. Kim Wagner, Amritsar 1919, An Empire of Fear and the Making of a Massacre. Thank you very much for joining the Sikh Channel team and for discussing your latest book, which has been released in the centenary remembrance year of Jallianwala Bagh, which is a very important memory and a vivid history which all Sikhs and Punjabis recall, often with pride, that such sacrifice was made, which led to the creation of India. and we'd like to thank you very much for joining us. Finally, can you comment upon the Sikh contribution to the creation of India, because Jallianwala Bagh does feature in the Sikh holy city of Amritsar, and the Sikhs do like to take a lot of credit, acknowledgement as being a very small community, but we played a very large part in creating modern day India. What's your view on that? What's your opinion on the Sikh perspective in the creation of India?
Well, I think no doubt that Punjab was sort of supposedly the bastion of loyalty within the British Raj, and really played a significant role in terms of military support and recruitment, as we know, during both World Wars, but also played a significant role in terms of anti-colonial resistance and the Ghadar movement. And so you have these somewhat contradictory influences, and I think it's worth getting all the nuances when we sort of look at the past and try to remember what actually happened.
That's tremendous. Thank you very much for joining us, and we do hope everybody will go out and read this book. It's available on Amazon, and please read the book for an accurate history of Jallianwala Bagh. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes.